Welcome to Reader Seeks Romance Channel's Romance Roundup, the #1 romance book recs talk show. I am Liz Donatelli.
And I'm Libby K, author of the sweet romance series Buckeye Falls and the upcoming When Sparks Fly.
Libby and I are exploring the psychology of romance fiction tropes with historical romance author and psychologist Sri Savita. Yes, friends, we will finally find out why Libby enjoys unhoused romance protagonists. Sri Savita is a cognitive psychologist who researches and teaches about reading, memory, attention, and language. Sri is not a clinician. The insights and opinions she shares today on the show are not prescriptive. Sri's insights and opinions are based on her experiences as a reader and author, who is also an academic research scientist and professor. Watch Romance Roundup on Reader Seeks Romance Channel and subscribe on YouTube. Listen to Romance Roundup on PodBean and all podcast apps. Follow us on Instagram at Libby K Author and at Reader Seeks Romance. Hello, Libby. Hello, Sri.
Liz. Hello, Sri.
Hello. I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. I am so excited. Ever since Liz said that she talked to you and got you on the show, I'm like, questions galore. I'm so excited.
Good. I'm excited.
Sri, you are a psychologist and the author of historical romance The Deed with the Duke, which is part of the Cards of Passion anthology series. And according to the description, The Deed with the Duke is a steamy, lust at first sight Regency romance with a grumpy Indian hero, a sunshine Indian heroine, and adorable animal antics. So first off, are there pigs? Is that one of the animals?
There's no pigs.
Okay.
Is there more than one type of animal?
Yes.
Ooh.
I can tell you what's there. There's a cat. There's a puppy. There's a goat. And what else am I forgetting? Cat, puppy, goat. There's horses, obviously, and there's like town lore around a badger. So there's a badger there too.
Oh,
my
fun.
God.
Badgers usually don't show up as sidekicks in romance novels.
No, they don't. He's sort of like squatting at this abandoned cottage before she gets there.
Awesome.
Our official mascot of the show, Jimmy, the little boy coal miner, can't you just see him with a sidekick badger?
Yes, smoking his little pipe and walking around with a badger.
Oh my God. Before we get any further, can you share what The Deed with the Duke is about?
The hero, Roz, is the Duke of Winsbury. He's in the title as the Duke. And there's a cottage that's important to his parents. So his dad has an attachment to this, summer retreat. The deed has sort of gone missing and his dad has passed. And one of the things that he wants to do is find this deed and see what's going on with the cottage. And partially, it's because he's grieving, and his mom and his brother and everyone, they're kind of like, you need to, sort some things out. Why don't you take this little bit of time? And he sort of makes that his thing that he's going to do. So he expects that, he's just going to go to this town, see what's going on, and doesn't expect to find anybody living there. And so Camellia, the heroine, has won the deed in, a gaming den. It sort of got passed through like a solicitor and then somebody else, and then she got it. So she's been living there when he gets there. And there's sort of a little bit of friction, because he's like, well, I have the title. This is a property that belongs with our estate. And she says, well, tough luck. I have the deed. And there's also animals that she has acquired as she's there. And so that's where we get some of those shenanigans.
I
like that she's already pushing back, and I like that she has like half a zoo with her to like help with her claim.
Yeah. I mean, I love, this is more on the side of like the sort of country comedic kind of English historical, Tessa Dare does a lot of that kind of thing. So it's in that sort of realm. I like the, nosy neighbors, this sort of like small town vibe, but historical. So we get a little bit of that. We get some softness. And we talk about, in some of the questions that you'd sent me, the power dynamics and things like that. So class differences are a great way to look at that in historical. And I really like playing with that. I like having heroines that are kind of strong from the start. And she's the one that's a little bit more flirtatious. She's got this sort of charmer, charlatan kind of vibe to her. And She was just a very fun character to write.
So now you play with the grumpy sunshine trope. So I
Yeah.
thought that would be a great place to start. First of all, Grumpy Sunshine has existed for eons, but it just recently got a title and a category, so now everyone's like Grumpy Sunshine, Grumpy Sunshine. Why do you think that is so gratifying for so many people to read? Like that whole Grumpy Sunshine, like
Mhm.
is it because of the sexual tension that people ascribe to that love-hate relationship? Oh, they hate each other, but they really must love each other? I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on just that. But what would you say in your academic opinion?
I would say, yeah, I think there's something about, and I can tell you a little bit about why I gravitate towards it. So I
Okay.
enjoy that kind of friction, and some of that enemies to lovers kind of energy right from the start because, I think there's something appealing to me about kind of having your full undiluted personality on display from the start.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's encouraging to readers to feel like, yeah, we can be just as prickly as we are, or, warts and all, and someone's going to be attracted to that from the start because there is always that little spark that forms even from the challenges and the argumentation. And I think, that friction is appealing for a lot of reasons. I think there's the sexual tension there. The other thing too that comes along with that, like specifically for Camellia, the sunshine is a facade for some of the things that she's hiding, with that charm, right? So she's kind of putting this defense up, and then you sort of see her vulnerable later on. So she can sort of maintain the power when it's just, saying these flirtatious things and kind of keeping that distance. She has to put this smile on. I think it's interesting to think about the role that women have in a lot of these situations where sometimes they need to be the smiley or sunshiny one.
Hmm.
And then, of course, when you have a grumpy hero, people love seeing the soft, gooey center behind that. And, oh, he's only nice to this heroine, or he only cares about her,
Hmm.
right? There's something satisfying and special about that too.
I think that maybe that's why I like that, is that it's like, oh, you're singled out as the one person that he likes enough to be nice to.
It's well earned. It feels like they earn
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
the well-earned piece of it. It's also, because I like playing with that in different ways too. Like even if you have like the rake, for example, and he's, charming around everybody, then the special piece that you get to see is like, oh, well, he only falls apart around her. Or like he
Hmm.
sort of shows that like that's not the real me, right? This is what I am. I'm a mess on the inside. So like I love, and I do this with all my heroes, like I love to sort of break them down in a way. Like they're gonna cry at some point and it's gonna be emotional, and you're just gonna feel like, oh, he's only that way when he's around her, right? There's that like softness, that vulnerability that you don't really see in somebody. And especially because you don't expect it in like, the alpha male that's very typical of historical and paranormal and other genres too.
Yeah. And this could be a whole other episode, but Libby and I have talked both on and off the show about how these tropes like grumpy sunshine and alpha males and all that, that. We might like reading about those stories, but if our partners behaved that way, we'd be like, oh, get out of here. Like,
Yeah.
when my husband acts like an a-hole, I say, you could get away with that if I was reading about you,
Yeah.
in a romance. I said, but you can't do this in real life. Like this, I don't find at all attractive or appealing.
Yes. That's how I feel about second chances. The stuff that happens in second chance romances, I'm like, absolutely not. But I love them and I read them all the time. So yeah,
I was going
I
to say
just
that's a popular one that people also feel very strongly about. I mean, I know we'll get to The Secret Baby, but Second Chance is one that I hear a lot of people don't like. I also really like it, and I like writing it. And I also love a lot of the really angsty types of tropes, like marriage and trouble, like I said,
hmm
enemies to lovers. Um, anything that has a lot of that sort of friction, like we're married to make an heir, like all these things where like the setup is really, you know, pushing them into a really challenging thing to overcome. And I
hmm
don't want that level of drama in my day-to-day life, right? I like stability, I like routine, I like simplicity, but there's something that I think pulls a lot of tension from those kinds of setups. And I think it challenges the people to kind of redefine what that power balance is. Again, especially in historical, that's something that's important to get really up close and personal with.
Hmm.
Um, and I think also just I like the contrast of something being very like, pragmatic and almost unsexy from the start. And then you sort of build that, right? Like the initial encounters that they have while they're trying to make this air, it's very like clinical. And then you sort of get to a point where something changes. They're noticing things about each other. There's a dynamic that's different
Yeah.
in the bedroom than out of the bedroom, whether that's, the power balance or, again, the things that they're learning about each other. And I like that kind of stuff. I think that's where some of the hurt comfort is interesting to look at too, because
Yes.
you get that same sort of, I'm seeing this person in a different way. And what does that mean when we sort of like wake up the next morning or we go out of the house? Like, how does that change or not change the dynamic?
Yeah. Hurt comfort. You just hit on one of Libby's
Yep.
catnip. And what's interesting is that she really likes hurt comfort. I do not. And I've thought about it. It irritates me. Certain hurt comfort is fine, like if it's light hurt comfort, but ongoing hurt comfort for, where it's a major plot point really bothers me to the point of enraging me. And I found that that happened in a book I read. And I said, why is that? Because I go to therapy. I've done it for years. And I really like to get to the bottom of what's really going on here. And it's because in my experiences, there have been needy men in my family, uh, and it's been around their medical issues, some of which, were exaggerated a bit, and it's like, oh, I need you to do this, I need you to do that. And seeing the women in their lives bending over backwards and just always living their lives just around them and taking care of them, like drove me crazy. And now when I read things like that, like it is not like, so obviously, Libby, you've had different experiences with that in your life because that to me is like a trigger. It's like, ugh.
Well, and I won't go into my husband's medical history, but there was a moment a few years ago where we did have like our own little hurt comfort. He's alive and well, knock wood, everything's good. But it's funny because I couldn't read those when he was just getting out of the hospital because it was just like this is too close to home, and I was getting angry because I can't remember the book, but the book I was reading, they were miraculously healed in like a week, and I'm like, well, this is BS, and let me tell you why. But I feel like enough time has passed that I'm just like, okay, bring on the hurt comfort.
Again, it's a place where you get that vulnerability, you get that openness. And when we talk about, the characters that, need to find a new living situation immediately, or they're unhoused in some way, that's a place where, for me, that's stressful to think about, someone depending on me immediately. But if that's an experience that you have, or, again, it's a place where somebody has to be really open and honest right from the start. So you're kind of like ramping up the level of connection that two people have right from the start because they're in such a, you know, dire situation and they really need to lean on this person. And so I can see how that might be something that's comforting for people because you're getting that depth of connection and character if, the author's doing that well, right from the start. And that could be something that's really, just it pulls people in because there's that forced proximity and then you're just really zoomed in on those two characters for a really, long time. You just you dive deep right from the start. So I can see how that can be helpful. But I mean, I understand, the other side of that too, because again, for me, like I love seeing migraine representation. I get a lot of headaches and that is something that I like with the hurt comfort. And, there's always something that's nice about it when, it's the hero that's like, oh, I had nowhere to go. And like, I just came, right? People love that. So I think that's something that's comforting about that. But I also like it in the other direction too. Like I've written a pirate heroine and, she's, act first and think later. And he's the one that's like, stitching her up and can't show that he's like worried about her because she's gonna like, get mad at him about that. But so he's like angry, but he's like also trying to keep that contained and he's also trying to like sew up her wound. And there's just like a lot going on there. And that's always like a nice thing to write because they get, there's just so much emotion happening in those situations.
Right. Okay, does that resonate with you, Libby?
Yes, especially I'm also in therapy, so we don't need to go into that. But I am very, very impatient. And so I think you hit the nail on the head for me that not rushes it, but it's, you have a connection and it's like I don't, as the reader, I wouldn't have to work for it. Because sometimes, Liz and I talk about the lengths of books and
Yeah.
our moods with that. So I think that is definitely something, the rubber hits the road right away with what the trope and the
Mhm.
conflict is. And so as an impatient person by nature, I definitely think there's something there because I do like that kind of not instant love. I don't like that as much, which is funny
Yeah.
considering I'm impatient. But yeah, I think that there's already a conflict. We know what we're going to deal with. It's like, let's go.
And I think that's the difference. Like I think with like I label the D with the Duke as insta lust. It doesn't mean that that's fulfilled right away because you still have to keep that tension throughout. But
Hmm.
I think what you're saying is, it's kind of like the way I feel about conversations as an introvert. Like I don't want to do the small talk. Like I'd rather just cut to the heart of like what might be
Yes.
revealing about the person or is interesting or someplace for us to connect. And so when you have a trope like that, you zoom in right away and you're there.
Hmm.
Right. And that's why I like snowed in and you're
Yes.
trapped. So I rather it be that you're trapped than somebody is sick and that's what's bringing you together.
Right. You don't have to depend on the person, but you're still in that forced proximity. And I actually thought about, because you mentioned that you like the monster romances and the alien romances.
Yeah.
That to me is a place also where, I mean, there have been a lot of discourse about monster romances and the way they represent othered, populations historically and things like that. So I think that there's a place for that to sort of reveal, like, yeah, you're bringing forth like your true personality. Like that alien, that monster is not going to necessarily find common ground with the other person they're with, or if they also have some magic or whatever it might be. But you're there, you're trapped with each other. All your personality, all your quirks, all your flaws are there, and you have to, navigate that together. So to me, it seemed
Yeah.
like those are very similar interests that you both have, just coming at it from different angles.
We're like two peas in a
I was
pod.
just going to say, oh,
I like the deep dive. So, like you said, if you're, of different species or different planets, you immediately don't have a lot in common. So, you have to do that deep dive. And I like getting deep. And that could also be because I'm a Virgo, and Virgos are very
Yes.
analytical.
Yeah, I don't doubt that that's part of it. Also, there's an immediate sort of problem that you're working through. Like in all of these, the hurt comfort, the unhoused, the forced proximity, whether it's weather or whatever, there is something that you have to work together for, and that's going to show different sides of people. It's going to show some change within the character. So there's some, I don't know, like less contrived sorts of things that might be happening. Like it's not like, oh, what's your favorite color? And like, let's start there. It's like you have to jump in
Yeah.
and
hmm
see work with the person.
Yeah.
And usually that doesn't happen immediately. So you get some of the friction from
Right.
arguments and things like that.
Yeah. I just had an insight. I feel like I should be paying Sri for like therapy because I just had an insight that why, because I was wondering why I don't like the unhoused thing because it's
Yeah.
popular. I mean, that's been
hmm
going on for ages. Like, oops, we double booked the same vacation
Yes.
cottage, or
Yeah.
or something. I was like, oh no, I broke up with my boyfriend. Now I have no place to live, which is often what I think kickstarts the ones you like, Libby.
Yeah.
And I think it's because when I was in my 20s, we had to flee our house because there was a fire.
Oh,
We were unhoused and it was a lot of instability. And I think that's why when I hear about, oh, doesn't know where to live, like I start to get a little anxious. So, yeah, so I think that just makes me very uneasy. So it seems like I'm really bringing a lot of my own experiences, triggers, traumas, and everything into my reading experience. And I wish I could keep some of it out though, because I feel like it kind of,
Yeah.
like, I mean, do I just keep going to therapy, Sri, and
yeah.
and work it out so I can read these
I
books?
don't think that I mean, yes, I don't think that's a bad idea, definitely, all for therapy. I think, that's an interesting place to think about. I told you that some of the work that I do is in this like transportation kind of theory, this sort of simulation idea where when we're reading, what do we bring to fiction that sort of emulates the kind of real world processing that we're doing? So the sensory things, whether that's auditory or visual, do you imagine what the characters look like? Do you know something about what their accents sound like, depending on where that is taking place? And if you've heard that accent before, so those things are things that you're bringing to what you're reading. I think the sort of like level of empathy is like one reason why romance works well. Like for me, I think of it as almost like you're looking through like a fly's eyeballs. Like everything in romance is like so heightened, right? You're seeing everything and
hmm
feeling everything at a much different degree than in other genres. So I don't think that that's it makes perfect sense why you would be bringing so much of yourself to things. And I totally agree that there's certain things that, I can't read because of my specific, experiences as well. So I lost my younger sister to cancer in February of 2020.
Oh,
And I can't read anything that has that as a storyline, which means that a lot of contemporary is kind of out for me sometimes. And that's why I gravitate to a lot of historical and fantasy, because somehow grief in those scenarios, even though like in historical, you could argue it's more common, right? Like all these dukes are starting their lines because somebody passed, but it feels different. It feels more removed. I can separate the reality. I feel more of the escapism. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about. And when we get to Secret Baby, it's a similar thing where like that wall between escapism and reality shreds a little bit. And I think that that's what can make it less likable for a lot of people. And the other piece that you said, bringing yourself to some of these things and not liking certain things. I can't read anything that has a professor-student type of relationship.
yeah.
Like, that is it. Even if it's meant to be intentionally taboo,
Yeah.
that's a hard line for me,
Mhm.
So I think, and can I read power imbalances in other ways? Of course I can. I write about dukes, I read about dukes, I can do that in other ways, dark romance, whatever it might be. It's just when it comes to that, because I can't take that day job hat off and say, hey, I'm just reading, right? It doesn't allow
Yeah.
me this level of escapism and enjoyment.
No, I to a much lesser extent, this is so silly. I feel that with librarian heroes and heroines because I used to be a public librarian and sometimes it feels like the people who write these books have never stepped foot in a public library and I'm like, there's regulations, you can't do that. Like it takes me out of the story. And we've had book club books. Liz and I are in a couple book clubs together, and we've read some books that the scenes at the office are so detailed with like the reports they have to do. It's like giving me secondhand anxiety.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the reports I have to do for work. And next thing I know, I'm like, I don't even like this book.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel stressed out while I'm reading because I'm thinking of the things that they're doing, or because a lot of times that is, that's what's happening in romance. And I find this a lot with contemporary. It's like they're loading up all the different like internal conflict things.
Mhm.
They've just moved, they've got this job, like that's hanging in the balance. There's also all this family stuff going on. And I'm like, this doesn't feel like a romance to me because I'm thinking about managing all these different things on top of like the reality of what I'm doing. It's almost like you're watching something. And to me, it's like, there's like a glitch in like the illusion a little bit, and it's kind of going in and out of like, oh, I'm in this like perfect world, and then like here's the reality piece of it, and it gets distorted, right? It doesn't feel like a really like this rush of like this high level reading experience, because when I'm reading I do want to feel swept away, and I don't feel swept away in those moments.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
You
That's
want to be swept
perfectly
away,
said.
not overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want
Yes.
to be drowning. I want to be swept
Yeah.
away.
Do you think that there are authors loading up the tropes and having the checklist? It's got to have, enemies to lovers, and then they're fake dating at some point, and
Yeah.
then they're doing this, and their opposites attract. And do you see that more and more? That it's like, wow, people are trope loading?
As far as like trope fatigue, there's sort of a yes and no. This is true for a lot of things in psychology. The truth might be somewhere in the middle for some of these things. So I think the answer that I have for that is a little bit informed by my own experience. And I think one of those things is I'm very cautious about that argument. Oh, we're kind of done with this trope or whatever it might be, because I'm a BIPOC author. And so a lot of us haven't even gotten to write the tropes that people are sick of by this point, right? So you can't necessarily enforce those constraints on people that have just entered into being able to write about these things.
Right.
Mhm.
The second thing there is I would push back on like whether you're done with that, or is it just the way that the person employed that trope? Because 9 times out of 10, sometimes what I see is that people don't like the way that that author wrote about that trope, which again could be because their experience is different. And maybe the way that I'm writing about a particular trope is going to be different than somebody else. Because, there's some flexibility, not even within the trope, like you don't have to play it out the same way. Because the situations could be different, the genres are different. And so it might just be that you are tired of the way that it's typically been employed. And when you read some of the ones that are less typical, that also doesn't sit right. So people kind of want the thing they want in the way that they want it. I think one of the things that I've seen this conversation about a lot is the fake dating idea. And I think that's because people don't feel like there's enough stakes in the contemporary side of things. And so
Mhm.
again, it's more of the way that maybe that trope is being employed. And because, I think when there is a trend, people really gravitate to it. And then there could be some of that saturation because again, in order to kind of survive in the market, people want to be writing in a way that's been shown to be successful. So there's some of these other things that could just have to do with the number of options at that time and how similarly those options feel as you're reading them. And to your point about like loading up multiple tropes, I think that's a place where you might be trying to do something with the pacing or something with the tension or with the stakes. And so it feels like you need to just be like flipping the trope every single time. But you got to let some of that breathe a little bit. Like if you're doing enemies to lovers, like they can't get over that by like chapter 2. There needs to be some of that maintained, right? So that's just my take on that. Because again, I care a lot about enemies to lovers stories. And I feel like sometimes that's bandied about in a way where in contemporary, I'm like, are you really enemies? Like, what is going on here? Like, do your families have a long-standing feud? Like, what's happening here that's causing the enemies?
Yes. Do you think Liz and I have talked about this again on and off the show, the difference between enemies to lovers and rivals to lovers?
Yeah,
Because I think they both are great, and I think sometimes they can be basically the same thing. But
yep.
I feel like sometimes it should be called rivals instead of enemies.
I agree, especially the
Okay.
ones where it's like they're competing for a job or whatever it might be. Like
Yes.
I have a novella I'm working on where it's historical, it's set in India, and the hero and the heroine are rival sculptors, and like the Maharaja is like basically like, for his own whims, he like collects artists, and this was kind of historical, your power and as a royal was in the artists and the things that they can make for you, right? And so um she's sort of new when she's younger and he's older. So there's like the age gap thing where he's kind of like, I can't believe that she is like considered to be the better artist right now because like I've been doing this for a while. It's sort of beneath me to be competing with her. And it sort of pushes at some of those buttons for him. Um, and, again, there, I think it's a rivalries thing because they weren't enemies before they were kind of put into this situation where they need to compete against each other. So to me, that feels very clear about it being more of a rivalry than like, I really don't like you from the start for all these other reasons. It's like really pinpointed to one sort of competitive aspect. Like you're vying for the same thing. So like the job ones, I think we've seen a lot of those, like the hating game, things like that.
Right.
Mhm.
I think that's more of like when you've got that competition for the same thing, I would say that that's more of a rivalry because your reason for being enemies is because of that thing. If that thing
Yes.
wasn't there or there were two opportunities for both of you, maybe you wouldn't be enemies, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Thank you.
So we've mentioned a little bit about Secret Baby. And hands down, whenever we've talked to readers, authors, Secret Baby is the least favorite trope. Have you read Secret Baby?
I have read Secret Baby, and I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it depends on how it's done in the story. So I just read a Lorraine Heath one that had a secret baby. I think Pleasures of a Notorious Gentleman is the one that I'm thinking of. And I'll tell you that that's stressful on multiple levels. It's not actually that she, it's not the pregnancy, it's that like she's hiding the fact that she's not the real mother of this child that she brought. And he has
Oh.
amnesia. So like he doesn't actually remember that they didn't have, you know, sexual congress while they were both in the war and she was a nurse. So they're both hiding things from each other because he doesn't want to own up to the fact that he has amnesia. And she doesn't want him to find out that, like, actually, this is another woman's child because then you might not take the child. And, like, she doesn't want the kid to feel unwanted. So that's, like, pretty stressful that they're maintaining these big secrets from the start. The secret part, the deception part, I think, is uncomfortable because none of us wants to feel, I would assume, like a bad person when we're in these scenarios. And we don't want to feel that way about the main characters either. I mean, I think there's something to be said for growth and you want to give them flaws and things like that. But that's a place where, in terms of like the moral lessons we're always getting around lying and being true and honest, and especially in romance, like wanting to be your full self and bringing your truth and honesty, that's something that can be a little grating. And then also, I think, like I said, with that sort of like rupture in the fantasy kind of idea, um, for me, like I am not a parent. I don't really have the desire to be. That is something that seems very stressful to me, especially if it's a surprise or secret kind of pregnancy. And you might feel like, is the character going to be supported or not? Is there going to be some conflict or anger around this confession or whatever it might be? And a lot of people have experienced, having kids or being a parent. They know that that's no walk in the park. And I think,
Yeah.
so that's where it gets a little harder to think about like, I can see the road ahead and I can see the trouble they're going to have with trying to navigate this. Let me get off this ride now because it does not feel good,
Yes, that is same boat as you. children were not in the cards for us, which is fine. But I think for me, that's why I usually don't like secret baby or, surprise pregnancies, because I cannot get myself out of that situation that the heroine is in, and it just makes me a nervous wreck.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, agreed. I do not have any children, and when I think of, a surprise baby, I'm just like, oh no, what's going to
Yeah.
happen to their romantic lives because
Yeah.
the baby's going to ruin it.
Yeah.
So,
Too, like I think, fairly or not, the idea of, having a newborn and being a parent sort of breaks that sexy aspect of romance, right? And, that's not to say I'm all for writing um, whatever story feels right to you. I have a soft spot for quote unquote older characters in romance. I'm writing a parents prequel novella where the Duke's parents are 57 and they have a little bit of a marriage in crisis. And that's like a really rich place to kind of go into, like where things fell apart. Like, what was it like when they met? Was it because they have 5 kids and like that happened early on that some of the, magic went away? Like, I think there you really get to hone in on like what are the little things they know about each other, what do they still remember, how do they sort of recapture that. And again, that gets into some of the second chance things that I like. I really like that it requires you to be more thorough, right? If you're doing this for the
Mhm.
second time, you kind of need to be that tuned in to the person. And it also shows that if you make mistakes, it doesn't mean that you can't try to fix that, or
Yes.
it might be different, but it could be better, right? And so I think that's something that they have to come to terms with, which just feels like a nice thing to think about with life in general, right? I think for a lot of us, like especially in these trying times, there's a lot of things that might be changing for people. Like I said, grief is something that now I have really firsthand experience with, and I don't want to feel like that would make me less capable of love or, receiving it or giving it or understanding things, right? You don't want to feel on the outside because you have this experience that somebody else doesn't. And so it's
Mhm.
nice to think like, hey, you might find something that's different and it could be better.
right.
No, that's spot on. It's
Yeah.
funny, the marriage and trouble trope. I wrote a book that has that trope, and it is consistently my lowest selling book. And
Yeah.
when I'm at events and people are like, oh, what's this one about? What's this one about? And as soon as I say the marriage and trouble, I have had almost at every event someone say, oh, honey, I'm going through that in real life. I
Yeah.
don't want to read it. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then I'll just
Yeah.
hide this book for later. But it is just always so interesting how, forthright some people are with telling
Yeah.
you to your face why they don't want to. And then my heart is breaking because I'm like, oh no, I hope it works out. And then I'm thinking, but maybe
Yeah.
I don't want it to work out. I don't know these people.
It's hard. I mean, and again, there's something we said, like we said, there's going to be seasons for some of this, and maybe that'll be something that you can read when you feel a little bit more distance from it. And, for me, I think, again, not married, never been married. And so that's something that's a little bit more removed for me to write about. Like, as much as we're talking about things like sort of breaking that boundary between reality and escapism and not feeling as sexy, there's something for me to like the pragmatics of a relationship that I feel like are worth celebrating and showing. So I do actually
Mhm.
kind of like seeing them, have to work through some of this stuff. And I think we all
Right.
do, right? That we're rewarded with that happily ever after by seeing them go through something together and have to have those choice points and that
Mhm.
fact breakup and things like that. So I think for me, I do think that those like little gestures that mean so much are really more rewarding in some of those types of dynamics.
I agree.
There's value to marriage and trouble romances, but I think the name of the trope is what's killing people because
Yes.
marriage
Yeah.
and
Yes.
trouble. So, do you think something like second chance marriage or like
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's, even people don't like second chance, so I think they now have like reunion romance. That's another term for it. It could just be a
Oh,
rebrand. That might be it.
I like reunion
reunion
romance.
romance? See, now
That's good.
that is good. I've not heard that. Uh,
No. And
oh,
I
okay.
love me some alliteration. This is fabulous.
Yeah, I think that's a
Reunion.
good term, especially because, in the way that I, like, at least in the one I'm thinking of that I've written, that second chance, it wasn't that they actually had a chance to try the relationship and it didn't work. It's that, they were younger and there was like a misunderstanding about what she meant when she's like, well, I got to take over my parents' business and I have to go and like take this ship out to sea. Like, I'm not going to be here for a bit. And, I think he like took that as a no. And she was like, well, I just thought like it was a not for now kind of thing. And so there's, that sort of like misunderstanding. It's not even like a small one where it's like they could have had a conversation about it. It's like she literally had to leave. Like she was going to be on a boat and was like, I don't know what's going on here,
Right. This is also fascinating. Why do we like tropes? Is it necessary for human survival for us to categorize and organize as a way of
Yeah.
like protecting ourselves or something?
Yeah, I think there is this like, sometimes this may not be the exact same thing, but we talk about this like need for cognition that people have. Like there is a need to kind of think about and understand things and classify things and put some
Yeah.
sort of structure. We don't always like ambiguity. We don't like things that are unresolved. And so, especially for romance and especially with tropes, it's nice to have those familiar signposts. I think people are looking for that kind of thing. I mean, and the ultimate thing of having a happy ending is what kind of gets you through some of that stuff. Like I know for me, like I said, I love Lorraine Heath's books, and I'm pretty sure I've cried reading every single one of them. But I can get through that because I know at the end it's going to be worth it. And I'm probably going to cry again, but like for happy tears.
Yeah.
Right. Right. We talked a little bit via email about dark romance. My question to you was, does reading dark romance, dark fantasy tropes, such as morally gray protagonists and unbalanced power dynamics, help us to make sense of the world in which we live? And I'd like to add to that, that since I asked you that question, now I'm seeing a lot of dark romance stalker romances. And I'm like, so now that's a whole other than story. That's not just making sense of the world in which we live. I think it's also, I want to be obsessively adored. So are these like, what does that mean?
Well,
What
I
does that
think,
mean?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's not making sense of the world. I mean, I think,
Okay.
there's a lot, I don't know. This is just me saying, like, I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of discourse around, like,
Yeah.
it's not all men, but it is always a man. And so I think there's like this idea that there is this like, threat to safety for women. And so maybe that is something that people are gravitating to reading about because a lot of times in these stories, the heroine is fighting back, right? There is the asserting of agency. Like I like reading about the morally gray characters and some of those power dynamics, like I said, in historical and fantasy, it feels removed enough. But there's a lot of this, redefining of like a societal structure, or, there's literally some like she's got a battle with a sword because there's some sort of war going on. And so there are a lot of allegories that I think you can pull from that for the world that you're in. For me, it's always helpful if I sort of have to abstract that and then apply it rather than reading about the world that I'm actually in right now. But for
Mhm.
different people, that might resonate differently.
Now, did you have some questions about Butcher and Blackbird?
I thought that was how this was going to start. Is Sri, can you tell us why Libby's obsessed with this horrible book that is disturbing to everyone but me?
Have
But
you have you read it? Have you read it?
I have not read it.
Okay.
I have a low threshold for gore, and so I feel like that would not be up my.
please do not don't read it. It'll upset you. It'll upset me. Just don't read it. But I've read things about this before because when I'm again, conversations for my therapist. But when I'm not reading romance books, I'm usually obsessed with like true crime and horrible stuff like that. So when I found the Butcher and Blackbird books, it's not necessarily true crime, but there's this awful, violent vigilante side to the story, but they're also very romantic towards each other. And I was describing this to Liz and my husband, and everybody's like, "Are you okay?" And the answer was yes. It was lovely, 5 stars. But like, what is it that, this is something, it was very fast paced. There was a lot of high stakes. It was ridiculously gross. Again, nothing about that I want to recreate in my life ever. But I literally could not put the first 2 books down, and I might take a day off work when the third one comes out next month. Don't tell my boss. But like what is it about stuff that is just so out of left field and so random and so awful, but I loved it. And I'm not the only one. They wouldn't keep writing them if
No,
someone wasn't reading them.
a lot of people have read it and really liked it. And I think so that's the place where I think, reading fiction is that safe experimentation place where you can try out the thought experiment of like, let me slip into this persona or this world for a little bit. And maybe it tells you some things about yourself. And maybe it's just because you are seeking novelty, which human beings do. We do have brains that are wired for paying more attention to newer things. You know, we see that very early on with infants. Like they're going to go towards the thing that's shiny or the thing that's in motion or brightly colored. And some of that's adaptive. You know, we are monitoring our environments for signals we need to respond to. And it might also be in this way where we just want something to kind of shake things up a little bit or say, this isn't my day-to-day life. And when I close the book or I stop listening to it, I'm done with it. But for right now, I want to experience what that's like a little bit.
That makes me feel better. Thank you.
Yeah, we're curious, right? And so I think that that's part of that.
So I enjoy a good horror movie, not usually the super, super gory ones, but I enjoy horror. And I've noticed, and maybe this is, resonates with you as well, Libby, is that when I am at my angriest inside, raging about different things, I feel like it's a huge release to watch horror. So do you feel like maybe when you read Butcher and Blackbird at the perfect time where you needed
I
that
read it at
release?
a very stressful time, and I think that's probably what it was. Is I because I listened to it, and I listened to it driving to Pennsylvania while my dad was having surgery, and so I'm sure in my mind these people killing each other, I'm just like, this is great. Like this is totally different from what I was about to walk into. So he's fine, all alive and well, but at the time, very stressful.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. Like, not the exact same thing, but after my sister had passed, I was drawn to things that were a little bit more, like I said, the fantasy I was reading, there was a lot of, grief for darker themes, things that might have seemed like really heavy because I felt seen by those things more than like where things just seemed like, oh, it's this perfect, like utopian little small town. Like I felt validated that I was having these kinds of feelings and other people have experienced similar things. Like when someone wrote something where I'm like, wow, it speaks directly to the way I'm feeling right now. I can tell that this person understands grief. And I think, that's why we read in general is because it is a mirror for us and we like connecting in these ways. So I understand, like, it might have seemed strange that I was really being drawn to these darker things. But it was helpful in that time just to know that, someone's made it through this and you will. And like you said, I think if you're feeling those emotions that you can't necessarily express, reading something that allows you to kind of have that vent or channel for it is helpful.
That makes sense.
Agreed. I've always been the type that when I would read a romance book description, as soon as they mention, oh, someone died, they're grieving, I was like, oh, I don't want to deal with it. And my father passed away a couple of years ago, and I've noticed a total switch that now I appreciate and gravitate towards more that has more romances that have more serious talks about family dynamics, about grief, about parents passing away. So it's interesting how you gravitate towards the books that you need to read. You might not consciously realize you need to read them, but there's something inside of you unconsciously like you need to read this. This will help.
Some people like those things because it gives them some sort of idea of, maybe, like I said, someone's navigated this and you might know what to do too. You might not consciously be saying that you're trying to take lessons from these books, but I think sometimes pick up on things and we resonate with certain things. And then you kind of see like why that quote really spoke to you or whatever it might be. And then like you're saying, for me, when I had that immediate sort of grief and I was reading some of these things, I think it's nice to feel like, you don't have to be in like the perfect place in your life, or you don't have to have like everything going perfectly for you to still have a good life or to find love, right? Just to see that like it's okay to kind of be where you are right now, and I'm getting emotional just saying that because that's a big thing to really accept at all different times. I think like I didn't become a professor just for kicks, right? There's a lot of stuff that I've had to do to earn the PhD and get there and do the things I'm doing. I just got tenure recently. So,
Congratulations.
Thank you. So it's nice to feel like, and now I'm adding in the author stuff, even though I'm very driven in these ways, it doesn't mean that my life is too small to add someone to it if I want to, so I think that's a nice message to see. I think that's why in a lot of contemporary, we do have people that are, dealing with that pressure of the personal and the professional stuff so often.
Hmm.
Right. Right. Wow, this is good stuff.
I know. I'm loving this.
You had mentioned that you have some works in progress. What are the release dates? And do you have any
Yes.
titles that you want to
Yeah,
team?
that's a good question. I don't have any release dates right now. I have a couple of collab projects that'll be in fall of 2026. So I'm really just taking this year. The Deed with the Duke was my debut. That just came out in September. So I'm taking some time to really just write, kind of get back into the drafting and the revising and having that book be part of, just my world for a little bit. And I'm still learning how to balance that writing schedule and all those things too. So it'll be nice to take some time to write and then get some things out. So I don't have anything directly coming out, you know, towards the end of that pipeline right now.
Okay, gotcha.
Time flies. It'll be here before you know it.
I'm planning in like, increments of like 2 years or whatever. And I'm like, that's not even that far away,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Libby, did you have any other questions before I ask my last question?
Oh, no. This has been amazing, and I'm
Okay.
so happy.
Do you think, Sri, that there will be a no trope? So the trope will be there are no tropes in the romance. And that's the new thing is, oh, I have a no trope.
no. And the reason I think that is that I think people are looking for those familiar signposts. I think even if you say, hey, there's going to be happily ever after, one could argue that is a trope, right? That's like kind of a defining piece of the genre. And when you said no trope, immediately I'm thinking of like literary fiction, where you go in and you don't know what's going to happen. And for me, it's very rare that I'm reading something that's not romance. And it's a little daunting to go in and say, I don't know what to really expect here. Like I've read the blurb, but I don't know that I know how this is going to play out. Like, I don't have the map in my head of the beats and the typical arcs. Like at this point, I'm reading something and they'll have a first kiss and I'll just look at my audiobook and I'm like, oh yeah, that's around like 30%. Like that makes sense. Like I have it like programmed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that everyone has to adhere to the same, pieces of that. Like I said, if I have an Insulus book, some of that's going to be moved up, but I like that. I like feeling like, oh yes, I was right about that thing.
Yeah.
I like having something that I can sort of follow along with or predict. And so for me, I'm hoping we don't go in that direction because I think there's a lot of things that people do like. They have tropes they're passionate about and they have tropes that they're not passionate about. The good thing is that we all like different ones. So
Yeah.
That's true.
I appreciate when new tropes are created. And every day I feel like someone is claiming new tropes. There have been authors who have claimed new tropes on some of my other shows on Reader Seeks Romance channel. And I'm waiting for them to catch on because like people will declare, oh yeah, I'm the first to write this. And I wait to see if some of them catch on. Some of them haven't, some of them have.
that's how I feel about the micro tropes, right? Like those are
Yes.
things that
Yeah.
I really like. The micro trope that I really like is when or it could be like when they've just married also, and the hero will dismiss the lady's maid and be like, I'm gonna, undress her, I'm gonna take care of her, whatever it is. To me, that's him like saying, yeah, I'm going to like push for this intimacy in a way where, he's also like doing the thing where it's like, well, you have to listen to me or whatever, like he gets to assert some of that like ducal power, but in a way that's like, ooh, it's centered on her. And like, that feels great when you're reading. So that's like a micro trope that for me feels really satisfying to write because it's usually at a point where like one of them has to choose like, hey, I want to change how this has been between us.
Hmm.
And it's always nice when it's him because then the heroine doesn't have to be the more emotional one or doesn't have to be the one to make that first move.
Right. I totally even forgot about microtropes. That's
Yeah.
a whole other. Is there
You
a
have to come back on the show.
Oh my God. Yeah,
I would be happy to. I love
Perfect.
tropes. I love tropes.
this is awesome. Libby, being microtropes have been thrown out there. Is there one that comes to mind that you are particularly fond of?
And I don't even know if this is a microtrope or just something that happens. And it can be and this is not what it's called in any way, but
I don't
like,
know what mine is either. Like, I don't think there's a name for it, but because it comes up so often, I'm
yeah,
like, if you've done more than once, to me, that's a microtrope,
yes.
Right.
Like and this is a horrible way to describe it, but like, when you're in a car and the guy's driving and he slams on the brakes and he puts his arm out. I
Yes.
love those little moments where like they haven't really touched yet. And he
Yeah.
does something very simple to like, not in any way. I mean, obviously that's not a coming onto her situation, but like just like an a subconscious, like, I need to help her, I need to protect her. I've been noticing those popping up in contemporary and historicals that I've been reading. And I just like those little moments of like you're seeing, or depending on the point of view, the other character is seeing like, oh, they cared enough that they didn't want me to fly through the windshield or something. I'm doing a bad job explaining it, but
So, just a quick note about the protective arm.
Yeah, it is like a protective thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Or like a caretaking-ish kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I immediately like I don't think of that as romantic because growing up, that's what my mom did all the time. Which
Oh, I mean,
obviously is
yeah.
that as soon as she would, although it also means she must have been speeding a lot because
Yeah.
she would press on the brake and then immediately her arm would come out because one of us is sitting, or sometimes it was just the groceries sitting on the or
Yeah,
her
no, I
person
mean-
like, sitting on, and she's like, I do that all the time, protecting things from flying off.
Yeah,
So
right. It's like protecting my purse on the
yeah,
passenger seat.
usually
Exactly.
that's what I'm doing. So, but I get what you're saying, that that type of like a show of protective
Instinct. They don't
yeah,
think
protective instinct.
Yes.
nice. It's like, okay, well, we have seen like, oh, you revealed your cards first, and like, no takebacks on that. Like we saw
Yeah.
that you impulsively did this, you know?
Yeah. I like when the only one bed is played with and there's different, like they've had only one bunk bed, one tent, things
Mhm.
like I like when they, authors play with that, but I don't know if there's a real microtrope. I feel like there's so many microtropes.
Don't
I
like
know.
the only one hotel room or like the unhoused piece of it, but you're okay with the only one bed.
Yeah, because the only one bed could be in the snowed-in house
Yeah.
or cabin, which they
They don't have
both.
enough individual space for each other,
Yeah.
but when it comes to the bedroom, there's one.
You see, I'm also I'm a full of contradictions as well.
No, so am I. So am I.
Yeah.
That's why I pointed that out, because I have some of those things too. And that's why it goes back to what I was saying about, people liking certain tropes or not liking others or saying ones are overplayed. I think it really just comes down to we like the thing we like to that very specific degree. And we want it to be delivered in that way. We want to read more of that. And so I think that's why I kind of honed in on that, because I do that too, where I'm like,
Yeah.
interesting, because I don't like this, but when this person does it in this particular story, I do like it there,
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And in
Yep.
that case, I guess it's a testament to the execution
Yeah,
of
totally.
of the story. There's been plenty of things I'm like, I would not normally have liked any of this, but because it was written by the capable hand of this particular author, I bought in. Like I think we've talked about that a
Like
number of
about
times.
the
Oh,
age
yeah.
gap. It's very much, it's got to be delivered in the way that works best for me. And
Yeah.
usually if it's not a contemporary setting, it's definitely not going to have, any flavor of like boss, employee, professor, student. It's just going to be some
Mhm.
other type of dynamic. And, I think it's just good to kind of like know that there's those degrees of differences and the
Right.
flexibility of how people are writing these things. And that's why I said I think they're not going to go away, because usually what people are fans of or upset by is I just didn't like when it was done in this way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Sri Savita, for this enlightening conversation on romance fiction tropes. We do hope that you will come back because I feel like we have just scratched the surface.
I
Yes.
agree. Yeah, there's a lot of rich ground here to cover. It'd be great to have episodes where we like deep dive into one particular trope and maybe look at like how it's
Heck
been
yeah.
across a few genres or something, just spitballing an idea.
I would love for you to be the resident psychologist of Romance Roundup.
We'll
Yeah.
get you a pink shirt.
Actually, well, your pink shirt will be in the mail.
Perfect.
And that's our roundup. Watch Romance Roundup on Reader Seeks Romance channel and subscribe on YouTube. Listen to Romance Roundup on PodBean and all podcast apps. Thanks for joining us, romance readers.
Happy reading, everyone.